appreciate everybody being on here today. We get a lot of questions about the Leader Practitioner course. So what we're going to do now for the next 2.5 days is take you through all 670 slides that we've associated with it. And I know you're all certainly looking forward to that. I think a few of you at this point realize it is also April Fool's. So no, you won't get that. All you'll get will be just an overview. So let's go to the next chart here, please. And I'm ably assisted today by one of my favorite people, Olivia Baroni, who does a lot of this across the board for all of our SBP webinars. And I'm just appreciative for Olivia for doing the good work that she's doing. So thank you, Olivia. So if we look at the 22 to 26 strategy, one of the things that you'll see here is the circle, right? This is our strategy from 22 to 26. One of the things I'll point out to you, though, is the idea that all 5 phases have advise in it. And we use the Leader Practitioner course basically as the linchpin that helps us in all of our advise work. We are critical in both the plan, the respond, the recover, the community development, and the anticipate stages. But what I would say to all of SBP Nation is, folks, we all got to be advisors. If we're going to reduce the time between disaster and recovery, all of us have to be advisors, but that does require us to be proficient in all phases. So let's go to the next chart, please, Olivia. So this is an overview of what we do and how we do it. Basically, like a good NASCAR driver, I will now thank the sponsor. We're funded in large part by the Walmart Foundation. That is a grant that they have given us, and they are seeking very, very specific outcomes. One of the things I'll say here is this is a course, not a conference. So it does include both a test and a graduation. So oftentimes people want to come to conferences, but we don't, we're much more in the course venue. Now, having said that, most students will tell you after they've graduated from the Leader Practitioner course that they learned just as much or more from their peers as they did from anyone who was in the instructor cadre. We are focused exclusively on the HUD Community Development Block Grant for disaster recovery. You'll hear this buzzword thrown around quite often, CDBG-DR, and mitigation, CDBG-MIT. And as a part of our work, we also conduct monthly webinars. We're probably going to influence somewhere around 1,000 grantees this year alone in webinars. So our next webinar coming up is on 6 April. You're welcome to join us for that. We can certainly provide you with the linkage, the registration links. But let's talk about our target audience. So our target audience for this are public administrators who are leading CDBG-DR and MIT programs. Now, without boring you to death about a disaster, because many of you in here know far more about disasters than I do, I will say that when you have a hurricane, specifically a hurricane, or a tornado that recently ripped through through Kentucky that went through multiple states, these things cover multiple counties. In most of my disaster experience dealing with the hurricanes I did in South Carolina, those generally impacted 20 to 24 counties. So what we're interested in here is what we will refer to as long-term, area-wide, enterprise-level disaster recovery. Doesn't mean that we don't also train the people who need to work on the stormwater management in their little town if they got a CDBG-DR grant, but specifically, we're after doing something on a large scale. And that's basically one of the things that we teach in our program management piece. Folks, we only train public administrators and other nonprofit organizations. That's it. JR and crew do not train contractors. If contractors wanted to be trained in this, they can pay through the nose and get somebody to train their organizations, but we do not train contractors. Our instructor cadre is one of the things I'm most proud of. We take both retired folks like myself and current folks who are running CDBG-DR programs, and we do pay them, and we bring them to New Orleans, and they help us teach this program, this thing called CDBG-DR grant, and how to administrate it. So with that, let's go to the next chart. And what I will say to you here is, here are our course goals. So the very first course goal that we center ourselves on is the idea that we want to train, inform, and educate disaster recovery leaders, specifically in the DR and MIT grants. We're going to provide them with methodologies we're going to explain to them that, hey, if you do this, you can expect this outcome. If you do that, you can expect that outcome. But more importantly, we're going to explain to them the advantages and disadvantages that are associated with all those things. Now, when you think about a large-scale enterprise-wide disaster recovery grant, folks, that encompasses a lot of different things. It encompasses program management, construction management, compliance with a plethora of federal cross-cutting requirements, as well as financing. How are we going to finance this thing? How are we going to take this grant, and how are we going to make sure that it's appropriately financed across the board? So our primary focus here is to use government, leverage government, that have government entities that have received the CDBG-DR grant, and help them to help us reduce the time between disaster and recovery. Let's go to the next chart, please. So if you've been around me for longer than 10 minutes, I will probably slap you with this chart, okay? This is the recovery process. We spend a great deal of time teaching this one sheet of paper right here. And while it may look complex and the font sizes may be small, what it is telling you is that there are big buckets in the disaster recovery and disaster response world. On the left-hand side, at the top of the chart, you will notice a thing called the National Response Framework. This is where FEMA comes in. This is the idea of pulling in preparedness and short-term recovery. And when you think of the great work that our FEMA brothers and sisters do, they're out there trying to provide immediate assistance and all things, individual assistance, public assistance, debris removal, all those things. And then we transition from that into the National Disaster Recovery Framework, NDRF. That's where I live, okay? I live over here on the long-term recovery side. So the first bucket is the bucket of what I call response, and the second bucket is what I call recovery. So we spend most of our time working in the recovery sphere on the right-hand side of the chart. But it's important for all public administrators to figure out contextually, because context is king here, where did I come from, what's already been done, and how do I move forward from here? So just a thought here that if you're not familiar with the National Response Framework or the National Disaster Recovery Framework, I will strongly encourage you, because we're all trying to be SBP advised folks, that you would take note of those and maybe skim them. It doesn't take long to read. Both of them are real easy reads. Let's go to the next chart, please. And this is the house. All right. So in every block of instruction that we provide to a public administrator who is administering this grant, we start with this house block. Now, we start with a house because we believe that housing is the most important thing that we can do in the DR world. And it's also the absolute hardest thing to do in the DR world. And we start at the bottom. We start with the idea that, look, we have to have strong leaders. Now, you don't have to be a perfect leader, because none of us are, but you have to be strong enough in your leadership capabilities in order to pull this house together. And from that, we spend quite a bit of time talking about decision-making, program strategy. We will spend a great deal of time talking about procurement and contracts for public officials, and how they can ensure themselves that they'll at least contract for outcome rather than contracting for effort. One of my great frustrations in life is reading a lot of these contracts. A lot of public agencies will contract and say, look, you need to come here and help us with our disaster, and we're going to pay you for your effort. Effort is no way to go through this. There's no way to go through in contracting. We need you to give us defined outcome. We spend time talking about the technology, specifically a system of record, and we work our way all the way up to the chart to the point to where we get to pre-construction, construction, and post-construction. We divide it into 3 categories. We do that because pre-construction is the idea of ensuring that we have the appropriate environmental to go work on a house at 123 Pine Street. And then we're going to have to do a damage assessment. We're going to have to turn that damage assessment into an ECOR, estimated cost of repair. Then we're going to have to turn that into a statement of work or scope of work, hand it off into the construction phase. And then we're going to do very, very specific standards that we're going to do on a house in the construction phase. And post-construction, of course, is this idea of warranties and how are we going to handle warranties. Now, the house is bounded on the left by compliance. This is federal taxpayer dollars. They will always, always, always be scrutinized. And so as a result of that, we need to ensure that we're in strict compliance with all the numerous federal cross-cutting regulations that are associated with this grant. And on the right-hand side is auditing. We want to make sure that there is no fraud, waste, and abuse. So if I were to sum up the entire LPC, this thing you keep hearing about in one chart, this is basically what it is. And we show this the very first and the very end of every block of instruction that we provide. So let's go to the next chart. Thank you, Rick. I just saw Rick saying I've been here for 3 years. Good, thank you, buddy. Rick's one of my great instructors down here. So I'm going to take you now through and give you a general flavor of what we do in LPC, and specifically what we talk about. I'm not going to cover this in any greater boring detail. My intention is not to bore you to tears today, but to show you a flavor, if you will, of some of the things that we are teaching. So let's go to the next chart. We do start with basic leadership. Basic leadership is the idea that leadership has 3 outcomes: purpose, motivation, and direction. I personally believe that direction is the greatest of these 3 things. This is what leaders provide on the left-hand side of the screen. On the right-hand side of the screen is management. And management is this idea that we need to be as ruthlessly effective and efficient as we possibly can, because the more ruthlessly efficient we are, the more money, people, and time we save. And that makes us better for donors, better for public dollars. It makes us just better. And of course, the leader in the middle is working tirelessly to provide the highest quality of clarity in their communications and provide unity of effort to make sure that one person is doing one job and they're doing it well and faithfully. And that's accountability. A lot of other things come into that. The bottom line for here is we lead people, we manage things. Next chart. We also spend a great deal of time talking about strategy. When we talk about strategy, and all of you in here, even though strategy is the most overused word in the English language today, all of you in here have had a strategy before. You had a strategy when you bought a house. You had a strategy when you bought a vehicle, bought a bicycle, or tried to attract a mate. You had a strategy. So strategy is something that all of you in here have. And strategy always starts with the idea that we start with the end in mind. So we always start with the end state. What do we want to do? One of the things I will tell you is that most strategies fail because the people in charge of the strategy cannot discern what they want. Folks, if you don't know what you want in terms of the end state of your strategy, the end state of your disaster in this case, I can help shape you with that, but it's really hard if you don't know what you want. So we ask people to visualize, describe, and direct toward the end. And then that's matched up with the ways, right? The ways are the methods, if you will, of how are we going to achieve this end state that we've described to ourselves. And we have to ask ourselves some questions in here. Is it feasible, suitable, and acceptable? Does it solve problems? Is the squeeze worth the juice? That's a good way of putting cost-benefit analysis into a neat little phrase there. Of course, is it always moral and ethical? And of course, the means, right? We have to have the people, time plus money will always be means. So we spend a lot of time talking about strategy because, as my friend Rick McDermott would say, most of these disasters fail because the grantee simply doesn't figure out what the strategy, they don't have an idea of what they want in the end. So if you can't figure out what the end is, any path in the world will get you there. This does probably, if I align the word strategy to some of your dating lives, maybe that would be an adequate way of looking at it. If you don't know what you want, any path will get you there. Next chart. That was pretty funny for me anyway. So what we also say is welcome to Crazy Train, okay? A disaster is absolutely crazy, both in the response and transition to, both in response and in transition to the idea of recovery. So we start with this idea that you're now here. You've got elected officials who are just, look, elected officials, what they want is people back in their home as quickly as they can. They put pressure on the state emergency management folks. You've got these public servants out here who are trying to figure it all out. Disaster case managers enter. You've got the executive, because these grants always go to the executive branch, whether that be a governor or a mayor. You got that disaster survivor who's like, all I want is my roof back. You got volunteer groups who will come out of the woodwork. Many of you in here have lived through Crazy Train before. And you've got contractors. Now, my big fear with contractors is that they'll walk in the door when you're at your most vulnerable and say, look, if you'll just transfer maybe 40 or $50 million of this to me and my team, we're experts on this. But the truth is that most of them have never run a disaster in their entire life. It's a scam in some ways. There are good contractors. I know them, but the vast majority, it's a bad lot. Okay. Then we're looking at how are we going to run this grant through subrecipients. We got to look at all these other things in here, federal and environmental laws. What does the county want? And then what does that match up with? The county's local code, right? We've got procurement laws, we've got mitigation. So folks, when you get into disaster, you are truly riding the crazy train. Some of you in here who are familiar with Ozzy Osbourne of old will understand part of this analogy here. Some of you need to do a little history there on your YouTube and look up Ozzy Osbourne on the crazy train. All right, let's go to the next chart. So we do spend a lot of time discussing the details of how do you administer this grant. So let's go to the next chart, and I'll go through these relatively quickly. But by and large, this is a standard timeline that you would see in any disaster. Basically, the disaster occurs. The Federal Register will not come out. The least amount of time that a Federal Register can be released is 120 days post-disaster. Most of them take somewhere between 6 months and a year before they're even released. So this model is based upon the idea that the Federal Register does in fact come out at 120 days. So the grantee is then required to submit certifications to HUD, build an implementation plan, build an action plan. When I use the word action plan here, I'm talking about what is your strategy? What do you want to accomplish? Then HUD's going to take time to approve it. If you're going to hire a contractor, you need to start a state government procurement, which is always a dicey proposition. And then you get a contractor on the ground and you start intake somewhere around 510 days past the disaster. That's too long. So our mission, our goal is to reduce the time between disaster and recovery. And we start with our friends at HUD and we start with our friends at the state and local government levels and talk to them about these timelines and how we can reduce them. Let's go to the next chart. Very quickly here, the new, Caitlin, I'll get to the Federal Register in just a second. The Federal Register basically is the law, if you will, of it is the public law that allows us to expend public funding. Okay, so a Federal Register notice is Congress is going to authorize money for a disaster, and then they're going to tell HUD, you will be administering this disaster. HUD then has to put it into public law and put it into a notice in the Federal Register. That will also tell you all of the limitations and constraints of the grant, what you can spend the money, where you cannot spend the money. And this last Federal Register reduced some time in that it reduced the time for a 7-day public comment period. It combined the implementation plan and action plan timeline both for 120 days. But still, even given that, it's still some 400 days after a disaster has taken place. Let's go to the next chart. So one of the other things we talk about here is what HUD cares about, because HUD is the people who are giving the state or the grantee, the state or the city, the money. And what we talk about here is what does HUD care about? Well, these are HUD's national objectives. HUD is designed to work on a benefit for low to moderate income people, elimination of slum and blight, and urgent need. And they will allow you to do a lot of different things in that. That includes housing, economic revitalization, public service, administration planning. But they will normally almost always tell you that when they give you this $100 million grant or $500 million grant, or in some cases, $1 billion grant, that 70% of that money should go to benefit low to moderate income people. Unfortunately, HUD will also tell you that 80% of that funding has to be spent in areas that they designate in the Federal Register. Those are called most impacted and distressed areas. And so what we are attempting to do here is to talk to our grantees about how can we spend this money very, very wisely, and how can we keep within the constraints of all the key laws and federal regulations you see listed here. You've got to do this program, but there are federal laws involved and you cannot violate federal law. That puts a lot of people into orange jumpsuits very quickly. Let's go to the next chart.
JR, if I could pause you just real quick. Caitlin asked, what is a Federal Register?
Okay, let's go back one. As a matter of fact, I'll get to it in just 1 second. Okay, let me I'm probably jumping ahead a little bit. Give me one more step here. Give me one more chart here, and then I'll go through this, and then I'll hit the Federal Register. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yes, sir. All right, let's go to the next one. All right, so one of the things that we have to do here, thanks, Rick, is we have to designate activities, right? So we have to spend some time doing this. And this is kind of a technical chart, but we spend a lot of time with our grantees talking about how do you do that? How do you designate an activity, okay? And then we go from here to the next chart. We spend some time talking about policies, how to write a good policy, why a policy is important, and go to the next chart. And here we begin talking to people about this idea of the process flow in the Federal Register, okay? And I'll spend some time talking about the Federal Register here in just a second. So that should bring everybody back to square one. All right, let's go to the next chart. So this is how we see the world operating, all right? So if you look at the action planning process, we put it in a linear sequential process flow. We start with the idea that you had a disaster. After that disaster is over, we need to then gather all the data that we possibly can across the board. That includes how many people filed for FEMA individual assistance, what the average need was, what the average FEMA payout was. All of you in here deal with this far more often nowadays than I did. What HUD requires us to do is they're going to require us to do a needs assessment. A needs assessment then is an idea, an intellectual, I guess, academic paper, if you will, that basically says, where are you going to spend the money based upon the things that we've told you where to spend the money at? So if you look below that, you see the Federal Register Notice. The Federal Register Notice, as I said, is a federal document that comes out, and this is the basis, if I could use a loose term here, it is the legal basis for the award. So remember that there is no such thing as free money or government money. This is all your money. This is all your taxpayer money. And so the federal government has a vested interest, if you will, in ensuring that it's spent where the federal government told you to spend it at. We just talked earlier about the idea that the federal government is telling you that this money needs to be spent in low to moderate income communities and low to moderate income individuals. So what's going to happen is you're going to conduct that needs assessment, and it's going to tell you, you know, this disaster has really impacted my housing. So from that, I'm going to have to determine my programs, right? What programs do I need to run? Am I going to run an owner-occupied housing program, a rental program, a multifamily program? And then from that, you're going to have to then determine what is my capacity to do that as a government official. Do I need to hire more people? Do I need to get a contractor? And then the federal government requires you to do certifications. Look, if the federal government is going to give you a $50 million or a $500 million grant, you need to certify that you can financially handle that grant. After that, you're going to build the program, and that's where we come back into this idea of the action plan, which is our strategy, right? So it took us a while to build this strategy, but one of the things we spend a great deal of time talking about is how do we build this strategy? How do we put it all together? Let's go to the next chart. The new action planning process also includes the idea that we have to, you know, in our needs assessment, we're going to have to do one for basically recovery and one for mitigation. And in determining programs, we now need to discuss mitigation activities. Mitigation activities could be something as simple as elevating homes. So let's go to the next chart. So when I throw these loops in here, what I'm trying to point out to you is that we have to determine what areas were first impacted. That's part of the needs assessment, right? Did we have more housing damage, more infrastructure damage, or did we have economic revitalization needs? That's going to combine with that Federal Register Notice, and that's basically going to tell us, you know, we're going to determine what the recovery needs to do in terms of housing and infrastructure and economic revitalization, and how much money the recovery has. So we spend a great deal of time in our course talking through all of these things. Let's go to the next chart. The clock, unfortunately, is on the public servant at this point. And what you see is that public servants are under a very, very strict timeline. Basically, they've got about 120 days to come up with a strategy of how they're going to recover from this. And this is hard. This is hard work. Let's go to the next chart. This simply shows, as we teach, we build through all of these different blocks. So what we're attempting to do here is teach each of these in some sense of detail to where the grantees can see it and understand it. Let's go to the next chart. One of the things that we spend a great deal of time talking to people about is simple Dick and Jane charts like this, which we think helps with programmatics, and we think helps with thinking, right? The very first thing we have to figure out is what happened in this disaster, where did it happen, and to whom did it happen to? Let's be real candid here. If Bill Gates and other very, very wealthy people end up with a terrible disaster, they will recover themselves. So do we really need to spend taxpayer money on them? That's an excellent question to ask. And then we go to the next question is, what did HUD tell me to do in the Federal Register notice? Well, HUD told me that I needed to spend 70% of my money, normally almost always, on low to moderate income people. So, and it's going to tell me several limitations, several constraints, several things that this is public law. This is the law now that is involved in what I'm doing. And then I have to determine myself, what kind of programs do I need to run? And what do the impacted communities think about this? Some impacted communities may say, you know what, we appreciate your idea to come in here and mitigate, but our voice is that we need housing help. So we have to consciously take in their input. And then you have to ask yourself, do I have the right number of people with the right skills, knowledge, and experience? And if I have gaps, how do I tend to fix them? At one point, the little red in the bottom is for us in South Carolina. At one point, we were recovering simultaneously from Hurricane Joaquin in 2015, Hurricane Matthew in 2016, Hurricane Florence in 2018, and we had a considerable $157 million mitigation grant going on simultaneously. So we're constantly asking ourselves these questions, and one grant may very well impact or affect another grant. So one of the things we don't ever want to do is make the classic bureaucratic mistake of putting a whole bunch of government money into a house, and then 3 months later coming out and buying out the house and destroying it, because that's just a waste of money. And we've limited the number of people that we can serve based upon decisions like that. So it all starts with planning. Let's go to the next chart. This is a cut from the Federal Register. This is the only one that I chose, but you feel free to look at and just simply Google a HUD CDBG-DR Federal Register. And this is one of the allocation tables that you will see in it. Basically, HUD is going to tell you where you can spend the money. And you'll note down here in the red block that they're saying no less than 57 million in those particular counties and zip codes. And so HUD is telling you, and HUD has taken all the FEMA data that they could get, and they have attempted at the bureaucratic level to look at the storm and say, what are we going after here, right? Across the board, what are we trying to solve for? And they're going to tell you where that money needs to be spent. We call them most impacted and distressed areas. Next chart. We spent a lot of time talking about money, right? Because this is a huge grant, and describe why the FEMA data is important. Okay, yep. So if you have data transfer is something that is absolutely critical in everything that happens here. So FEMA, if I were to go back to the very, very first chart, and don't do this, Olivia, just let me talk it out in my head. We have FEMA coming in, which is one federal bureaucracy. And FEMA is going to do what its bureaucracy is designed to do, which is provide immediate help within the aspects of the Stafford Act, which puts it on the ground for basically 179 days for a presidentially declared disaster. So FEMA is going to come in and do that. The second thing that's going to happen is then HUD is going to get involved, which is another bureaucracy. What we have to be able to do is ensure that FEMA data passes from the FEMA people on the left-hand side of the chart to the HUD people on the right-hand side of the chart. And this data is absolutely critical for us because we need to know how many people were impacted, how those people were impacted, and what needs FEMA gave them. There's also another little nifty thing out here called duplication of benefits, which the federal government does not allow you to do. So if you got money in repairing your house from FEMA, one of the problems with that is that when HUD comes along, we have to deduct a lot of that money because we can't duplicate money. So it's called duplication of benefits from the federal government. We spend a great deal of time talking about money, and specifically, this is a lot of 2 CFR 200 type things. But the grant gives you both administrative cost and activity delivery costs. So we spend a lot of time talking about this particular stuff. Again, I'm not trying to teach the whole course, just trying to give you a flavor for what we talk about. Let's go to the next chart. This is SOBI. I will tell you, I am a huge SOBI fan because SOBI allows me to look at the world from the aspect of where are low to moderate income people groupings. and where are high income groupings, right? So it's no stranger to any of us that there are high income neighborhoods in America and there are low income neighborhoods in America. We need to map those out. And what social vulnerability indexing does basically is it does that. And you'll note here the dark red areas are those folks who are probably not going to recover themselves. You get into the pink areas, these people are going to have a harder time recovering themselves. The truth is the people in the blue areas, they're going to recover themselves. They have the means, they have insurance, they have all the other things that will help them to basically recover themselves. The truth is in disasters in America, most Americans are going to have the capability to recover themselves. This grant is designed to help those who will not, or do not have the capacity, do not have the means. And specifically, if you're talking about folks who are age 65 and over, or people who have children in the household who are below age 5 and below, they're going to have a hard time recovering from a disaster. So SOVI helps us to point that out. We use it in outreach. Next chart. And what I mean by outreach is this is all of the FEMA damage of $5,000 and above on a SOVI map. So what this tells me is that any of those places where they're red and pink, those are places I need to do outreach at. I need to send a team up there and see how many people we can make eligible. We do that by advertising in the newspaper and in the television sets, social media, and saying, come talk to us. We may be able to help you with your disaster damage. So that's a lot of damage there at $5,000 and above. You'll note that I'm not real interested in sending teams to the blue areas because the blue areas here are areas where I know people are generally going to recover themselves. Doesn't mean we won't send teams in there. Please don't get me wrong. Just means that I'm not going to spend as much time there as I am in those areas where I know we can help people. And we use this in our outreach processes. Let's go to the next chart. We spend a lot of time talking to grantees about how do you define your disaster damage. This is a math problem that we generally work through and talk about in the LPC, and we think it generally does a pretty good job of talking to them about how we determine a housing unmet need. And we spent some time talking about this. Next chart. We discussed contracting, right? We spend a lot of time with contracting and federal cost-cutting requirements. Let's go to the next chart. One of the things that irritates me to no end, and one of my personal, I guess, triggers, if you will, is to see a government contract that is not well written, in which the contractor basically can come in and try hard, not accomplish anything, take your money and leave. And trust me, we see this everywhere all the time. And I think that some folks on here can say amen to this because you've seen it yourselves. And this is sad. And it's on the public servant to write a good contract. The truth is that most of our good public servants out here haven't had to do this. They have never in their life had to have written a $100 million, $500 million, $1 billion contract. So this is tough. This is tough stuff. So let's go to the next chart. And what we talk about here, we do spend some time talking about these. We refer to these as the federal cross-cutting requirements. And we talk about each and every one of these in some detail. These are the things that this is federal law. No doubt about it. This is all federal law. You have to be able to pass your environmentals, your URA, Uniform Relocation Act. You have to be able to talk about limited English proficiency, fair housing, and civil rights laws. These are absolutely critical, and you can't bypass them. So our teaching methodology here is we talk to the grantee about how they can most efficiently and effectively ensure compliance with all these critical federal laws. Let's go to the next chart. We spend a lot of time talking about process flow and discipline in the process flow, especially in housing. Next chart. We spent some time talking about organizational effectiveness. We talk about the idea of performance management, which we think is absolutely critical. And that's also in line with organizational design. Are we designed for success? Talent development. How do we develop talent, and how do we make sure that our cultures align with that? And when change comes, how are we going to manage that? Next chart. The process flow, though, is here. So we will spend a great deal of time talking to grantees about this housing process flow. Okay. So we're talking about the idea that we're going to outreach. Remember, I showed you SOVI early, right? So we're going to go to those dark red areas and we are going to look at people and we are going to then do intake. Intake is this idea that you're going to have to give me some documents. The citizen must have skin in the game. When the citizen has skin in the game, we then have to determine if that citizen is eligible for our program. Now, the truth is that a lot are and some aren't. And the ones that aren't sometimes can be difficult to deal with. But the truth is when you tell them that, look, you make way too much money for us to help you. This is not a free handout government program. This is designed for people who are not going to be able to recover themselves. So we do have quite a bit of drama, I guess, if you will, that is associated around eligibility. We spend a great deal of time talking about expectation management, which is the idea that, look, if the federal government is going to give you this program, you now are required to have flood insurance. We talk to them about the idea that we cannot draw a county permit unless you have paid up all of your taxes. Now, there will be people out there that we're trying to help who don't have the means to do this. And we have to be able to help them also. So there are off ramps that we work on here. We spend time in pre-construction, construction, and post-construction, as I talked about earlier. And then we spend time talking about financial and contract management. And we do talk a little bit about closeout. And we talk about the standards for auditing. So this is probably one of the hallmarks of our course, is that if we can get people thinking in the Toyota method. So for those of you that saw this and immediately went to, wait a minute, this is Toyota, this is housing on Toyota production. Yep, you're with me. We're in the same boat right here. So that's what we're trying to do, is take Toyota production methodologies and turn them into a housing program on a grand enterprise level scale. Next chart. We do spend a great deal of time talking about a disciplined system of record, right? We need one coherent system of record that will encompass that entire process flow I just showed you. But more importantly, it has to be disciplined. A good rule of thumb is if it did not happen in the system of record, it did not happen. So no contractor gets paid, nothing happens, period, unless it's inside the system of record. Next chart. And we spend a lot of time talking about critical enabling functions, and I'll go through these very quickly. Next chart. They are basically the ability of a government organization to audit itself, monitor itself, have compliance, have legal, and then to make sure that it finances itself across the board. So we spend some time talking about that. Next chart. We discuss internally assessing a program. Next chart. And common pitfalls. So one of the things that we will spend with grantees, especially slow spenders, people who are not doing well, is we ask them some questions. What is slowing your program down? And why are you not making milestones? And we will get into the depth here. Is it a policy issue, a contractor issue? We're going to play blame the contractor. Is it a training issue? Do your people know what they're doing? Is it a finance contract? Just basically effectiveness, capacity, personnel. And then we always have to ask ourselves, am I doing things right, or am I doing the right things? And so those are all questions that we will put before them. And then finally, next chart, we spend a lot of time talking about the top pitfalls that we see, right? Dulcie, your question, go back one, please, Olivia. So what we see oftentimes is a couple of different things, and I hate to say this, but it's a myriad of issues, right? I'll give you an example. Most of you know we just came back from an assessment visit, and I won't say where it's from, but that particular layout had some policies that were basically a lift from Superstorm Sandy. A contractor had come in, taken the policies they'd used in Superstorm Sandy, so the policies were wrong, right? So then we had to say to ourselves, do we have enough people to do this? The contractors had robbed some of these folks blind. Their people were not trained to notice that, and then financially they were unstable. So I think it's a lot of different things, both contractor and contracting. And so, yeah, I guess if I saw a trend, it would be this entire bubble, because when I go to do an assessment of somebody, I'm looking for the whole bubble. I'm trying to find out where the ugly's at. That's what I tell the team. We are ugly finders, and we're out to determine as much ugly as we can possibly find. Because that's what they're paying us to do. They're paying us to do that, and then provide recommendations, of course, on how they can fix it. Next chart. So the top pitfalls that we see are here, right? We see teams that simply are not organized for success. We see a lot of failures in contracting, planning. We see some, not near as much as it used to be, over-promising, in which we would have people go out and promise the community that they would rebuild every house in the community or do something really stupid like that. We occasionally see folks who fail to follow the law, what's in the Federal Register, or 2 CFR 200 financial regulations or things of that nature. Oftentimes we see bureaucratic paralysis. Basically, we see bureaucrats who fail to make a decision. They simply cannot make a decision. And when that happens, all it does is elongate and lengthen the program. And we see some people who have failure to adapt. I will tell you from political interference perspective, that's probably the easiest one. You will hear the public administrator constantly blame their politicians. But the truth is the politician just wants an outcome. And so it's the easiest crutch that I see happening in the DR world. But we do see some political interference. We also teach how to avoid political interference. And that basically is that as soon as you get this grant, you need to be running to your politician saying, this is what we can do, and comma, this is what we cannot do. That keeps your politicians out of trouble also. Next chart. So last but not least is the idea that we're going to focus on outcomes rather than effort. Next chart. And we show this particular chart here, which is one of my favorites, this is what a great successful program should look like. The HUD CDBG-DR grant is a 6-year grant, 6-year grant. So what needs to happen in a 6-year grant is in year 1 and 2, you need to be ramping up. Years 3, 4, and 5, you need to be spending a whole bunch of money, and you need to be using that as your credibility, because your credibility is what did you do with the money. And in year 6, you need to be ramping down fast and shutting that program down and moving on, waiting for the next disaster to hit you. But this is what we try to get them to be able to think in terms of. If I could put it all into one picture, this is part of the business operation that we teach. Next chart. So with that, I'll start my video back up, and I'll answer any questions, comments, or opposing viewpoints that you may have. And if you want to, we can pull the charts down, or if you want to look at a specific chart, we can talk about that. So I stand ready now to answer any questions, comments, or opposing viewpoints you've had. Please don't think that my speaking so fast here, I took 2.5 days and I compressed it into a 42-minute briefing for you to give you a flavor of what we do. But if you have any technical questions or anything you'd like to ask, I'm certainly willing to answer. And if not, I have the great Rick McDermott on here, and he's Saint Rick will answer any of your questions. Go.
Hey, JR, I have one thing to add. Failure in the DR world is so common that when we first in the South Carolina program met with HUD, and this was big HUD, they were down there to talk about our action plan. They said the following, and this wasn't even the local rep. He said, be prepared to fire your first contractor.
Yeah.
And that's a direct quote. It is so so common. And the reason for that, I think, goes back to the thing that you've highlighted, which is no plan. I mean, nobody wakes up in the morning, goes outside and says, gee, I think I'll get hit by a tornado today.
Yeah.
So there's just no plan there. And as a result, there's no strategy. And what that means is that the people who have just been thrown overboard into this, DR flood, if you will, grab for any life ring they can. And that is where the contractors come out like gnats on a hot, humid day. And they tell you that they're experts, but what they're experts in is, as you said, effort, not outcomes. Because if you read their brochures, you will not find, a SMART goal in there that says, hey, we did this specific thing against this measurement in this time frame. They'll tell you about how many dollars they spent. They'll tell you about how quickly they mobilized. They'll tell you about how they wrote up a plan or something like that. But that's really, that's all effort. That has nothing to do with the outcomes. And so as a result, you end up with that. And not only that, but the contractors will only do what they're asked to do. So I'm working with the program right now, and they've been at it since November of 2020. So this is not a new thing. And as of last week, they finally put together an actual process flow for where all the subfolders will be and what they want in there in the system of record. So that's crazy that you're, over a year into the program and you're just now figuring out, oh, maybe I ought to have, a process flow that says this record, this grant agreement ought to go in this subfolder, under this heading. And so you just see that lack of organization and truly deep thought across the thing. Somebody asked earlier about, why was FEMA data important? And truthfully, it's not just the FEMA data, it's actually being able to advise early on in the process, because all of these things have been repeated so many times. It's almost like they're institutionalized in the recovery world. And so you have to get to a different dynamic if you're really going to shrink the time. And that was probably, I'll blow a little smoke towards JR's direction here, so he'll feel a little breeze coming up his pant legs. But that was one of the brilliant things about the South Carolina one, was we were not hampered by we've always done it that way, or allowing a contractor to come in and say, well, this is the way we do it. As a matter of fact, one came in and briefed that. It says, well, your guys' idea is crazy. You should do it this way, and this is what we would do if you hire us. Needless to say, we didn't hire them. But that's kind of the brilliance right there of being able to look at it and say, look, get a strategy, identify what it is. And I'm really excited by the advise function getting involved early on to give folks kind of a picture of this is what your disaster looks like right now. And here are some things you should think about. You have, 3,000 SBA, small businesses that have been impacted, and you only have 3 SBA loans. Well, what's happening with all those, 30,000 employees? What's going on? That kind of thing. So being able to advise, the people who are going to eventually administer the grant and tell the story, to say, hey, you should look at this, think about these things. So with that, I will shut up.
Hey, thank you, buddy. I appreciate that. I think that was good. And you gave me a chance to breathe and think a little bit. This is the one thing I guess I would say for those that ask the question about our teaching. We teach the LPC generally 4 or 5 times a year, and then we do a webinar. Right, Olivia does great work in putting together these webinars. So we will run a webinar a month. Our next one's on 6 April. So if you're interested in talking and hearing somebody really dive into the depth of what we're doing here, we're going to do that on 6 April. I missed the last question. So what was the last one there? Can you tell us a bit about how LPC is expanding this year? Yeah, I think so, Brittany. What we're going to do this year is we're spending more and more time talking about mitigation. The DR grant, the idea that we're going to, the new Federal Register requires people to spend at least 15% on mitigation. So specifically our 20 to 22 September LPC that we will hold in New Orleans will be focused on this idea of mitigation. And I think we'll be able to do the mitigation piece and work it. I think we're getting a lot more people out there who are saying, you know what, I'm fairly comfortable with DR, but this mitigation thing is so new to me. How do you run a program like that? And so we're spending a great deal of time building the curriculum for that.
Hey, JR, I'd love to just jump in real quick. First of all, thank you for this. This is such a clear kind of run through. Just in its complexity, it really shows what these government leaders are faced with for the first time, And when we went to Walmart first with this request, there was very much a clear problem across the country for these grantees that they were spending slowly. It was called like the HUD slow spenders list, right? And that translated into like billions of dollars that weren't getting to poor people fast enough. And so Walmart came in and helped us get this program started. And to your credit and to the Advise Advocate team, have just built this really high demand, one of a kind program for these government leaders who I've come to learn, thanks to you all, that these are all really great people who want to do well by their community, but don't have the navigational beacon to do so. And so what this program is doing is giving these public servants direction to serve the people. And when we talk about our mission of shrinking the time between disaster and recovery, this is one of those upstream solutions that's helping to shrink that time at scale. And so I'm just sharing you, like, first of all, thanks so much for building this. Excited that next week Walmart's going to be announcing the next 2 years of support for this program. And that's a true testament to the product that you've built here. And now for this team, everybody at SBP is a fundraiser, right? When you think about our needs as an organization, we need to do more of this, right? Like funding to scale programs like this and others is really going to start, doing that thing that we talk about, changing the way America prepares for and recovers from disasters. This is a big element of that. So thanks for walking us through this.
Well, thank you for all your great work in supporting this, but more importantly, thank you for being so brilliant and succinct in what you just said there. I mean, this is a huge problem across the nation. I mean, when you look at it from a big standpoint, disaster recovery for governments is a $70 billion a year business. And these contractors, and again, I don't mean to bash contractors, but their entire job in life is to watch the Weather Channel and then send a wave of lobbyists into that disaster-prone area and say, this is how we can help you, give us your money and we'll do it. And, unfortunately, I think that you're exactly right, that most public administrators are good people who've worked hard their whole life. And then all of a sudden somebody says, you've had a disaster, federal government's going to give you $500 million. Well, that's enough to stress anybody out, right? And so I think that that's part of it. So the way I do, Liz, the way that I get the instructors is normally I require everybody to go through the course before you can be an instructor, okay? And then what I do is for the cadre is I specifically go out. One of the things that I'm looking for and try to do is I try to recruit people who have a natural affinity to teach, right? Because one of the things we cannot do here is turn this into death by PowerPoint. This cannot be a lecture or death by PowerPoint. So what we do is we integrate questions into this. We need somebody that has a natural teaching ability. So we find those folks, and many of them work in states. By way of example, Miss Michelle Farr-Penloza, who's in West Virginia, is one of my instructors, a wonderful lady, just a great teacher. And so we do pay her to come down to New Orleans, and she's one of my adjunct professors. Miss Kathy Tremblay, who runs the DR program in Georgia. Miss Michelle Stennett, who runs the DR program in Colorado. So I bring these ladies in and we give them the curriculum. We will spend quite a bit of time. Anybody that's ever been through it, my rehearsal days are hard. They're probably the hardest day of the whole teach, right? Because I'm going to go through every chart that we're going to show and why we're showing that chart. Yeah, are you amening that, Rick? So we try to bring in these adjunct instructors, people when they have time to bring in. And of course, I consider Rick to be one of the best compliance guys in the nation. So I always try to bring him down when I can, when he's not busy doing his other stuff in Columbia or with grandchildren. And so what we attempt to do is put ourselves in a position where we provide a lot of cadre who are actually doing this now, so that everybody can have somebody they can talk to. That was a great question. Thank you for asking. Kyle,
I remember. Hey, JR, one last thing to follow up. It's Liz. Yes, I remember one of those instructors, I won't say which one, or maybe it was a different one, saying they went through your course and after the end of day one, went back to their hotel room and got very emotional because they felt like they were absolutely failing all the people that they were supposed to be serving, and stayed with it, came back the next day and ended up getting a lot out of the program and was able to go back and apply it and had really, really good results. And so, it's interesting to think about some of the instructors that you've highlighted for me and others who aren't people who started off just like getting this intuitively.
Right.
Or having tons of wins. Like they had to really go through and do the hard work to get to a place where they can now say very proudly, move the needle for a lot of folks, which I think really resonates with a lot of your attendees, that they can see that it takes work.
I absolutely appreciate that. This particular lady you're talking about, after day one, she or three of them, and they simply went and they tell the story that they just got together and started crying because they did not know what they were doing. And these are good, great people. You know, these are generally great people who are hardworking public servants, but they just never been educated on how the thing works, right? So thank you for that. Dulcie had a question. Dulcie always asks the most intelligent question, so let me see if I can answer this. Does HUD ever take money back? Yes, they do. As a matter of fact, Rick's dealing in his program now, and where he's working, they just HUD took back a bunch of money. HUD will come out and get money. They will take it back from people. Normally, almost always, that's because of they've spent the money in an ineligible activity. Right. So I showed you one chart up here earlier that talked about what were HUD eligible activities, or they served a client who was ineligible. That's normally where you see that. Rick, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, the ineligible piece is but you're right. It's those two things. It's an ineligible activity or a failure to do a good eligibility screen. The other one that will get people in trouble is duplication of benefits, that they already got an amount of money and there was no tie-in to, hey, they did what they were supposed to do with it or something like that. So those are the three primary ones. And it's usually when they come in and audit, it's not small amounts. You know, when you start talking about, you know, $200,000, that kind of stuff, it gets some people's attention, because unless you're a billionaire where you got a $1 billion grant, I mean, you know, some of these grants are down in the millions, and you start taking money out, and none of the grant money can be used for that. So that has to come out of your general fund or some other fund from whatever the county, you know, city, whatever the locale is. So that can be quite a significant emotional event for those folks.
And I think what causes it to get into the press is that as soon as HUD comes back and says, we're going to take money back from you, now all of a sudden the press gets involved, right? And politicians get involved, and the thing goes into what I call the ugly state. And it just begins to fall apart, right? And that's just really, really ugly and painful. So with that, Kyle, I think I'm at an hour here. I'll turn it back over to you for any intelligent stuff you would like to say. And I thank you all for listening. I ask all of you to be advisors, be good government advisors. Go out and if you run into somebody who is in need of government advising of this type, of this nature, this magnitude, then certainly give us a call, because this is our business. We're trying to reduce the time between disaster and recovery, and we're trying to do it in a different methodology by going after the governments. So there you go.
Fantastic, JR. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this this lunch and learn. Super informative. Everybody, I appreciate y'all being on this call and attentive. Olivia, thank you for running the deck. I'm going to make this after I download the video, make it available to everybody at SBP, so we can have it in the system for anybody who wants to review, anybody who missed it, any new hires in the future. But really appreciate everybody's time, and happy Friday.